first, give us a sense of exactly where this conflict stands vis-a-vis the idea of trying to get rid of Iran's ability to enrich uranium and to go forward with its nuclear program.
Excellent. So the overall goal seems to be to degrade, obviously, the nuclear program to the point where it's no longer considered an existential threat to Israel. And to the extent they'll take care of that, there's probably about 4 or 5 days left of bombing, in my estimation, based on the sites that have been hit. But in addition to that, they also took out senior military and national security regime targets that were responsible for command and control for potential retaliatory strikes, as well as ballistic missile systems, because that's what they've used to fire at Israel. So if we take a look, which was your main question, right, on in the nuclear sites here, right? So what we've seen is we've seen strikes, right? So we've seen over here at enrichment facilities here, heavy water reactor here. There's a nuclear plant here on this side for power, and then there's more facilities that are kind of scattered around the map. The big question right now is what happens to the deep buried facility at Fordow, the enrichment site? When it comes to Fordow, in your estimation, Israel does or does not have the capability to try and make serious damage to that facility, which is heavily fortified? And I mean, it's a great question, and that's the one that everybody's sort of looking at right now. There's only so many options, and when we're discussing this, by the way, we're not putting troops at risk. These are all speculated scenarios, so this is just for everybody at home, if you're wondering. That's what we're looking at here. So this is the deep buried facility. And speaking to the Iranians and having a weaponization program, they built this to withstand a conventional weapon strike. This was built under mountains, hardened concrete, and everything else, speaking to intentions, right? So what we see here is you've got main tunnel entrances on these sides, right? And then you've got the centrifuges under the mountain here, which is covering. So there's really only two options for the Israelis, and potentially a combination. So it would be heavy conventional bombing, which would be less than what we could do because they don't have the bunker busters, the B-2s, which we'll cover in a minute. But they would potentially be able to collapse the air shafts or the buildings. The other option, what would be called heroic means, which would be a ground raid into the facility. They've already done that previously in Syria, about 200 kilometers north of the border. They went in and successfully rendered safe in that mission. That is a very dangerous one here. As you can tell, there's only a couple entrances, and then any guns inside, that's where they're going to be pointed. And Syria is far closer. This is a much different scenario where it's 1,000 miles away as opposed to a few hundred. Yeah, the only thing is now that after the last week or so, the Israelis have both air superiority and air dominance because they've taken out the integrated air defense systems on the ground that can shoot missiles up, and their fighter jets are not going anywhere, and those that have been hit are out of there. So they can basically fly in. Question becomes, what about reinforcements in the area? The Israelis would be able to take care of that from the air. This is very much a viable opportunity, and it's the reason sort of they're waiting. What it tells me, though, is if they haven't done it yet, whatever the options are not as good as what the U.S. can bring, or else they would have done it already. They're waiting to see if we're going to get involved. That is a very good point. And speaking of the U.S., tell us where U.S. military assets are and are going, and what that means for this fight in the region. Sure, great point. So there's permanent large bases, which you'll see sort of depicted here in red, which are U.S. only. So we've got, we've got Al Udeid in Doha, Al Dhafra. We've got major bases in Kuwait, stuff further away in Turkey and whatnot. And then you'll see the black dots that are here, and those are joint bases, particularly the ones of concern for where people have been speculating they might hit. Again, we talked about this the other night, Baghdad, Kurdistan, up here along the Kurdish-controlled areas in Syria, along the border, which is of concern. But the U.S. has flexed assets in. So we have fighter jets that originally were in the UK the other day that have now been flexed in the region into Jordan. We've got fighters across the region at different bases that are there. We have 2 aircraft carrier battle groups, one that was there, one that was brought in from the Pacific. And then very shortly, I think next week, what we're going to have is we will find ourselves with an additional carrier battle group, which will be just about here in the Western Mediterranean, and then that can flex in to give General Kurilla at CENTCOM an additional capability should he need it. So massive amount of firepower has been brought in. Air defense systems protect U.S. troops. It's clear that the president's giving a 2-week window maximum, as he said today. I don't think the Israelis can withstand these ballistic missile attacks for that long, to be honest, because they're getting through in the multiple warheads. If he does decide to pull the trigger, if the president determines that's the right policy, we have the firepower to take it out, and we have the firepower to defend U.S. troops. And the regime would be in very, very poor decision-making if they decide to attack the U.S. The big worry, obviously, for Americans, for the American military, is retaliation. Iran says it's going to be able to retaliate in a major way if the United States joins. What would that look like? What would they strike? I mean, you've got the Strait of Hormuz there, which is extremely important to the world when it comes to what a quarter of the world's oil goes through that strait. Right. So in terms of oil and closing off the straits, as you're mentioning, the Straits of Hormuz, right over here, and you've got the ability to control. It's sort of a strategic choke point. There's 2 shipping lanes that go through there. If they were to put littoral mines in the water, like water mines or something else, or try to close it with ships, you have to worry about obviously the operators with the ships, but then also the insurance companies with riders on the boat. So they're going to let the boats through? How long do you have to wait till the water's clear? There's a whole bunch of dynamics there, but it doesn't help them from a financial perspective. It just kind of causes chaos and, quite frankly, would piss off all the neighboring countries because that's the main, economic mainstay. But likely targets would be U.S. in Iraq and Syria potentially, and then you could theoretically hit in the region. The U.S. has pulled the ships out of our ports in Bahrain, for the fleet's based out of. We've also moved fighter jets that was widely reported out of non-hardened bunkers in the area to make sure that they're safe. So the Iranians have ballistic missiles. The Israelis have taken out somewhere around half to two-thirds of the launchers, which is why they're having trouble getting them off. But there's probably 1,500 to 2,000 missiles left at that point, and they could be holding some in reserve, not only for a counterstrike, but more importantly, regime survival, because at the end of the day, that's all the authoritarians care about. They want to survive.
And there's also the proxies, although they've been very badly damaged as well, that could strike in some of these other parts of the region as well.
Certainly, that's a brilliant point. You have the Houthis down there in Yemen who are still firing missiles, though there's an agreement with the U.S. You have militias in Iraq and Syria that are the PMF, which is the umbrella group, served as the ground force to go after ISIS, which the U.S. used as part of its ground forces, provided support. Now they're quasi-integrated in the Iraqi military, which is bizarre. Hezbollah has been severely degraded. They may have some capability left. That's why your mainstay is really ballistic missile threat, some drones, and attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. But I'm being told from contacts that if the Iranians were to make that decision, the response from the U.S. would be overwhelming. The president doesn't want regime change. He's made it clear. Nobody wants to see nation and state building. They can't have a nuclear weapon. If they decide to make that mistake, it's going to be a very big one.